Hi everyone, welcome to our final week. So I thought we would do just a quick revision of all the main things that we've covered. So this could be a nice one if a couple of you have ended up not being able to watch all the lectures and so on, because remember that this is setting the foundations for some of the other units that you might do as you go along that are your pedagogy based ones or your ones that are focused on your planning and evaluation in further years. So let's look at our main points. So these are the things that we kind of covered as part of this unit. We went through your teaching cycle. We went through the things that we need to take into consideration when planning. We talked about how we link assessment and objectives, how we plan for 0 to 3-year-olds, different assessment forms and planning for all young learners, not just 0 to 3-year-olds. So if we look at our teaching cycle, let's add some extra bits in. So what do I already know about development? We also want to think about how am I going to document it? What curriculum approaches will I use? What strategies? How and what will I assess? How will I document it? What does the information tell me? How will I inform parents? And finally, how am I going to evaluate the whole box and dice that I've done? That's the main part that we really want to focus on. So let's think about when we're beginning to plan, where do we actually begin? So we've got some basic elements. You've got to know your students, you've got to know your curriculum, you've got to know your developmental milestones, you've got to know your school centre and system philosophies, and you have to bring it all together with your own philosophy. So how do you know your students? Think about your observations. We talked about different types of observations, how you actually plan for observations rather than just doing them off the cuff. How you can think about your assessment from the point of view of some formal assessments and some informal assessments, and things like interviews with the teachers and parents, so you're getting the view of all stakeholders. You really need to understand where your students are before you do any type of planning. So to know your students means you're going to plan for individuals, you're going to plan for groups, and you're going to plan using the physical and human resources that you have available. So there's no use planning these amazing things if you don't have those resources, and there's no use planning these fabulous things using all your great resources if it's not going to work for the kids. So start with the kids, plan for their groups, plan for individuals, plan using the physical and human resources you have. Now you've got to know your curriculum. So it means that you have to understand your EYLF. It means that you have to understand your SCASA documents. It means that you have to understand your kindergarten guidelines. And you have to think about your curriculum approaches. So remember that we've talked about all different types of approaches that we have. So you've got adult-centered through to child-led. You've got a thematic approach and your integrated approach. You've got your individual development versus a community of learners. You've got your emergent approach that comes through the transmission through to the constructivist. You're disconnecting with the natural worlds and your connections with the natural worlds. And some of those will make such beautiful connections with you, but others won't. So when we're thinking about children, we have to be really aware of their developmental milestones. So you've got to think, how do I find out more? So we start to look at it from their developmental domains. And remember, I gave you a whole lot of different links and so on that you can find and you can look up. So you think about their physical development, their emotional development, their social development, their spiritual and creative development, and their cognitive development. And we make sure that everything is linking and we're planning for it in different ways. So you have to be aware of your system, centre, and school philosophy. So you want to think, okay, how do I plan when I'm not sure what's going on system-wide? And that's why you can't do planning until you're really sure about what the centre philosophy is or what your school philosophy is. So I always get a bit worried when I hear that people do all their planning in January before they start teaching at the school. And I'm like, there must be a couple of other things you have to take into consideration. Now, part of your assignment that you did was you had to develop your own philosophy, and they were fabulous to read. So I wanted you to go through these questions. I wanted you to really think about what you believe. How do you work with children? What are your core values? What are your key statements? What theorists do you gravitate to? What actions or words offend you when somebody's talking about early years? Because sometimes working out what hits you in your core of your being, they're the things that make you passionate about things. So what are your favorite buzzwords when people talk about things? Do your actions reflect and match your words? So when you're thinking about things, I know that I am very passionate about play-based learning and helping children to individually develop and helping them to have a lot of fun and be super, super engaged. And I physically recoil when I see schools that are going about things in a really, really boring, content-focused manner, when I know that it is doing such damage to some children. But other teachers are comfortable with that. So you've got to work out, how is someone else going to describe your teaching style? So then it was thinking about your different approaches. So we went through things like the Reggio approach, things like the project approach, integrated approach, Montessori, Kathy Walker. And then you have to work out then, how do you take all of that and blend it into your documents that you've got to have? So when we think about planning, we do have to have documentation, because planning is an administrative requirement. It's a guide to action for all of us. It's something that helps us identify some problems before they start to become real problems. We look at planning from our long and our short-term planning. And finally, it is a true key to success for us, and it's absolutely essential. Again, I don't understand when some teachers say, oh, I don't bother with planning. I'm like, well, I don't understand how you would know what's going on. So when we think about our planning, we have to think about it from the point of view of short-term planning to our long-term planning, and daily planning to yearly planning. So your activities that you plan, they're your daily plans, and they're the things you do short-term, and they change quite rapidly. Your daily work pad, on the other hand, that starts to document your entire day, your term program or your learning areas, depending on what age group you're planning for. They might be for 2 weeks, 5 weeks, 10 weeks, completely depends on the year level that you're working with and the philosophy that you're approaching it with. You've got your year and your room curriculum. And so that depends on, are you in a school and working with year one, you've got a set curriculum from SCASA, versus are you in a childcare setting and you're working in the toddler room. You've got a curriculum that's probably organised around some things that your guiding people at the centre will be working out. And you've got your school and your centre planning. So sometimes there are school-based philosophies that you have to embed. You might be starting the Taught for Writing program. So that's just part of what you're going to be embedding as you go through a year in a school. Your objectives and your assessment have to link together. So when we're thinking about things, I always think they do form this chain where you've got your planning and it links into your teaching and it links into your assessment. You can't take one away without breaking the chain. You can't just teach if you haven't thought about things. You can't just assess if you haven't planned it and taught it. You can't do one without the other two intersecting at different points. So when we're thinking about our planning, teaching and assessing, it is our cycle, and they call it a cycle for a really good reason. They all link in one after the other. We've then got something that we have to think about with planning, and that is that sometimes as a new teacher in particular, or as a prac teacher, sometimes we plan a little bit too much, and that can actually be really overwhelming for children. So you've got to think, how do you break it down into something that is achievable but is not over-planned? And that's where we have people with all the best intentions in the world plan 10-minute rotations. Children don't work well in a 10-minute rotation. Give them half an hour. Give them time to explore something. Teach them how to spend a little bit more time on things. And then you'll find that they actually do a much better job. So that leads us into thinking about when we do our planning, we want to make sure that we plan from a strength-based perspective rather than just using that deficit model. So when we plan from what they're not doing, that's always working from a deficit model. We want to plan from what are they able to do and how do we get them to do it better? What are the things that we need to cover in the curriculum? How do we build those in based on what they already know? Rather than going, oh my goodness, there's 50 things they have to cover and they don't know 40 of them. Instead, go with they know 10, let's build on those 10. And then we can keep moving forward. So we always want to plan from a strength-based perspective, not looking at it purely from a deficit model. And it's amazing how many times I walk into early years rooms and they are unfortunately being suckered into that deficit model. So then when we're planning for very young children, those 0 to 3-year-olds, hasn't he got the best smile? I've been having fun finding pictures of different ones. So when we're thinking about planning for our very young children, we have to think about the quality that we're experiencing in a centre. So we want to think about the structural quality that we have within a centre and the process quality that we have within a centre. So you want to think about your staff and child ratios, the group size, the caregivers, the qualification, the stability of the staff, the equipment, the space, all the safety things, all the things that are included when an audit is done on your centre. You then want to think about all the things that affect the process. So the interactions and relationships between the children and the caregivers, the actual experiences that the caregivers are organising for the children to engage with. Are they really interesting in promoting discussions and getting language happening with the children? Are you, as part of your planning, making sure that you're being responsive to diversity? Are you creating great partnerships with families, creating nice shared philosophies, and finally engaging in that reflective thinking and decision making that we want to see existing in every single centre? So when we think about a planning process for under threes, it's very similar to planning for older children, but it has some subtle differences. So we want to start with the individual child's needs. We want to think about what are the guiding elements. So what are our centre documents? What are our state system requirements and so on? We want to develop our objectives and goals, but we want them to be domain-based and still specific. We want to develop a plan because they really are pivotal. The best plans have carers collaborating with the family. And in fourth year, you do an entire unit all based around families and partnerships. And our final thing is that we want to make sure that we actually plan to document and communicate regularly with all our people who are involved as active stakeholders with the children. So then what we think about with our planning process for under threes, because remember that we don't have a curriculum. So you're starting with different things. So you're starting with looking at caregiving as a curriculum. You're looking at the routines, the rituals, the schedules, the transitions, how you're grouping the children and what staff rosters you have. Because we've talked about how when you're working, say, in the baby room, you don't want to have different people on every day. You want to have the same people rostered on so that they develop beautiful bonds with all of those little gorgeous people that you're working with. So you want to make sure that we understand how things work and that we plan for that as part of our caregiving. We want to make sure that we build attachment as an actual curriculum, that we really think about the way that we have that feeling for the people in our lives. So we want to make sure that we are connecting with the children and they are connecting with us, because it is a shared partnership that you're having with the families and the other caregivers. And it's a different partnership, but it's very, very strong, and it should be full of all these amazing positive experiences for you and for them. So then we have our play as our curriculum as well. So we want to make sure that we build in all of those different play types, the different characteristics, a different range of experiences. All of those things need to be planned for when we're working with our very young learners. So what will it look like? Really, what we have to be aware of is that every single centre is going to have different expectations. So it's not saying, oh, this is exactly what it will look like. It's more a case that all of the formats, they're going to have similar information. So you're going to have some individual planning. In WA, we will always integrate our early years learning framework. We'll make sure that we have some nice clear goals and objectives, and they might be something for a week or something for 2 weeks or something for 3 months. It depends on the centre. It'll be based on the children's needs and interests. And finally, really good planning always has collaboration with families, always. And that could be any types of families that you're working on. So now we've thought about our planning and all of the different things that we have to consider when we're going through our planning. Let's have a look at our assessment. So assessment really is our missing piece in a puzzle. So when we're planning and we're teaching, if we're not assessing, we're just sending things out into a void. We've got to make sure. So why do we assess? For a very basic reason, we're monitoring the children's development and their learning. We're guiding our classroom planning and decision making. We're really identifying the great specific needs of our individuals. And we want to report and communicate with others. And those others could be other teachers, other caregivers, it could be the parents, it could be our principal, and it could even be our system level things. So all of those things need to be taken into consideration about why we do assessment. Now, what are we assessing? So we're assessing their growth and development domains. We're assessing our outcomes of the program. We're assessing how the children are developing together with their knowledge, their attitudes, and their interests. And we're also being really, really aware of any problems or concerns. And that might be some really targeted, focused assessment that we're looking at. So we have some very formal examples of assessment. So you might have some tests that you do. Those tests don't have to be written tests. It could be just you're getting all the children to perform the same physical tasks because you want to see their gross motor development. I could do some interviews or conferences with individuals or groups of kids because I really want to find out about sequencing that I've been doing with them. I might do some simple quizzes with them. I saw that a couple of you, at least one of the groups, did an actual Kahoot with the kids in the classroom the other day. It was fabulous. I might get some written responses from them about different things. I might get the children to complete some journals, and they might be doing their maths journal about the things that they've learnt over the last few weeks. And we could do some peer or self-assessments. So they're quite formal examples. Lots of times we do use those, but a lot of them require the children to read and write, so they're not as suitable for our very young learners. Whereas if we look at our informal examples, we've got observations of all different types. Brilliant. That becomes so useful for us. We've got conversations, and those conversations can be with children, with other educators, and with other caregivers. So they become part of how we build that better picture about what's going on in a child's life. And then we've got things like a think, pair, share. They're informal examples. So I could say, right, turn to your partner, tell them 2 things that you know about this. And then I listen and I watch and I see which children have no idea about what I'm talking about and which children are having a great old conversation, sharing everything about it. So then when we're doing our observations or we're doing any type of assessment, we have to make sure that we fit these 3 things. We've got to make sure that we have a degree of objectivity. So we want to avoid categories and labels. So saying they're just the dum-dum. I know I occasionally do that and you'll hear me say that, but I try and avoid categories and labels for particular children. They might have a diagnosis, but that doesn't label them. That just gives them one type of reason for that sort of behavior, but you don't want to say, oh, he's the autistic one and that's why he does that. You might say he's having a really bad day today. He's on the autism spectrum and some of the behaviors that he's exhibiting, we're trying to work out how we're going to manage them a bit better. You don't just throw a label and dismiss the behavior that's going on. The reason being, stereotyping devalues the purpose and the worth of the assessment. Because if you just say, oh, I'm not going to do that because they've got that diagnosis, no, we need to isolate out what's going on and how. And we have to be very objective in both the collecting and the recording. So you don't want to include your emotions with any of those sorts of things. So confidentiality, you're in a position of trust when you're working in an environment with small children and you're working with their parents and you're working with other caregivers and you're working with other teachers. So confidentiality means that everybody has the right to privacy and that you do not then go and write up anywhere and talk about all of the children and put their names and all of the pieces of information together. Everybody has that right. As much as you might hear some right juicy stories from different parents and so on, you don't then go and gossip about that with another parent. You might have a trusted person on staff that you talk to about things and you say, oh my goodness, I really don't know how to deal with this. But there's a big difference between seeking support from a colleague and just harmful gossip. So you want to make sure that you don't contravene anybody's right to privacy because, as it says, you are in a position of trust and we find out a lot of things that are not common knowledge and you don't need to be sharing some of those things with others. So you keep them in your vault. If they're important for the child's development, you write them down, but otherwise they're just part of what you learn when you are a teacher. Now, reporting. So this is something else that you need to consider. We make sure we're objective, we make sure we're confidential, but then we make sure we report. So we have to make sure that we have informal or formal reports depending on the year level that you're working with. Make sure that you're informed and prepared, so you know reports are coming up, say in year one, or pre-primary does them as well, and a lot of kindies now do them too. So we report twice a year. So you've got to make sure that you've collected all the data and that you are ready for those reports to come through. So decide how you're going to report. Sometimes there's no decisions to be made. It's only a case of you just follow the rules that your admin has told you are doing. Other times you will have choices about things. So then you have to create your good plan of action to make sure that you're actually going to be able to get it done, because they are hard deadlines. There's no asking for extensions on reports. They need to go out to mum and dad by a particular date, and they'll need to come into the principal or the assistant principals beforehand so that they can read the reports and then sign them and send them off. Or if they're reports that need to go to paediatricians and so on, then they'll have certain deadlines on them as well. Now, if we go through all of these things and we've thought about our planning, we've thought about how we're doing our assessment, we've thought about our teaching a little bit, so then we've got to go through this process of reflective practice. So what is reflective practice? So it gives us some advice about what we've done previously and how we're going. It gives us a potential direction for the future. It helps us to think about what we're actually doing and why we're doing it. So it's like doing some research. And you're trying to answer lots of important questions. So you first of all want to ask the right questions and then work out how to answer them. So you want to go through this reflective practice aspect. And it's become now part of our GTPA, which is what you will do at the end of your 4th year, your final school experience. Now, when we've got our thinking about how we're going through this whole reporting and all of those sorts of things, we've got to make sure that we always keep in mind that domains will guide our planning and our assessment. And so therefore, our evaluation has to go hand in hand with our reflection, and we don't get obsessed with all of the curriculum elements, because our domains should guide us, our early years framework, those more global documents. So when we evaluate, we want to make sure that we're taking into account the achievements of the children, our personal reflections, our full evaluative practices, our assessments of the children, and all of the other things that form an evaluation of a program. So when we evaluate, we look at these 3 aspects. How well am I actually teaching? And we define what that means. What aspects are pretty good and what aspects need to be improved. That's part of our reflective cycle. So when we think about it, it might be that behavior is one of those. So you want to plan to prevent those behavior problems before they even occur. And I find that a lot of the times when I'm dealing with teachers who are experiencing lots of behavior problems, I reckon at least 50% of them, it's a lot to do with the way you're doing things in the classroom, and 90% of them, if you change the way that you do things, those behavior problems will become very, very minimized and disappear. So you want to do your planning to prevent those behavior problems. You want to make sure you consider your environment. If you create the color explosion in your classroom, be prepared for the children to react to that. If you have a noisy and a cluttered classroom, be prepared for the children to react to that in probably a negative way. So you've got to consider your environment, how you plan to use your environment, and what you're going to put in it that reflects your personal philosophy. So you want to plan how to use your educational assistants and your other support people. And that could be the people that are assigned into your classroom, but it could also be, when we think about it from the point of view of parents coming in as well. So think about how you're actually going to use those support personnel that are available to you. And one of our last things is to realize that we have to think about early intervention. We are the people who see them at the coalface very, very early on, and we have to trust our instincts and then gather the right data to back them up so that we can organize early intervention, because it is essential and it creates a massive success for children if we can intervene early. Things like speech, occupational therapy, different therapies for children with cerebral palsy, different therapies for children on the autism spectrum. Different therapies are available for lots and lots of different things, but not if we don't highlight them and help parents sometimes to see them or do them as part of our school-based programs. So early intervention, absolutely essential. So if we go back to our things, our revision plan, we've looked at our teaching cycle. We've had lots of planning considerations. We've linked our assessments and our objectives. We've thought about planning for our 0 to 3-year-olds. We've covered all different forms of assessment, and we've looked at how to plan inclusively for all young learners. So I hope you have found this unit worthwhile. I hope you've found it useful for all of the things that we are doing. I've loved being with all of you and loved working with Lee and getting everything happening really beautifully for your lessons that you've been teaching out in the school. So hope to talk to some of you soon and hope this has been a nice little revision for you. Thanks everyone.